Hello, hi. Hi. This is amazing. I'm so glad you're here. I got to work about 30 minutes ago and I came in here and there were 2 people in the room. And I thought, okay, this is what they told me would happen. At some point everyone would just stop coming. And I thought today must be that day because it's our first really cold, terrifying cold, windy day. And I'll just never see you again. Goodbye. Goodbye, Russia, right? But no, you're here, so that's great. Thank you. As usual, I have a very happy theme for you, right? Urban poverty and natural disaster. You're welcome. We're going to talk about cities. We're going to talk about urbanization. And I'll explain why in a minute. But first, I want to start out by giving some numbers. Almost all of the data that I'll be using for the first part of class is from this book, right? So I won't always be attributing, you know how I normally attribute the text to an author? So just remember, almost everything I'm giving you is from Mike Davis's book called Planet of Slums, which is from 2006, right? So the numbers are not entirely up to date. So that's something to keep in mind, please. But I sort of, wherever I found things that I figured would probably need adjustment, I tried looking them up to see how the numbers have changed. Okay, so have a look, please. In 1950, 86 cities in the world with a population of over 1 million, right? There were 86 cities that had more than 1 million people. Today, that number is around 600, okay? Cities have absorbed nearly 2/3 of the global population explosion since 1950 and are currently growing by 1 million babies and migrants each week. At the same time, the global countryside has reached its maximum population and will begin to shrink after 2020. As a result, cities account for virtually all future world population growth, which is expected, as I'm sure you know, as I'm sure you've heard, to peak at about 10 billion in 2050. So 95% of this growth, right, will occur in the urban areas of developing countries, so in the poor countries, right, whose populations will double to nearly 4 billion over the next generation. Right, so as we're keeping all that in mind, let's have a look here and take a look at what that actually means. Right, so scholars talk about third world megacities. What is a megacity? A megacity has a population of over 8 million, and now we have this new category, the hypercity. The hypercity is the population over 20 million. And let's take a look at what we're talking about here, right? So Mexico City is at over 20 million. Seoul is at over 20 million. New York City is also at over 20 million, right? So it's also a megacity. But take a look at the difference. What's the difference between Mexico City, Seoul, and then New York? What difference do you see here between these cities? No, not the mathematical difference.
How differently they developed.
How differently they developed, right? How quickly the millions, right, grew, right, in the developing countries. Right, so that's why New York is here. It's here because it's not only a megacity, but the growth wasn't nearly as dramatic as it was in every single other one of these megacities. Okay, can you guys see? Do you want me to read these to you? Can you see in the back? Can you see the, do you want me to check your eyesight? Because I can. What does this say? Huh? Shanghai, okay, all right, you can see. Somebody can see back there. That's good. That's not nothing. Okay, so when we when we look at the names of these cities, we're talking about almost exclusively developing countries. Okay, so how did this happen? Why is it happening? One of the factors to keep in mind is what we call the world agrarian crisis. What does this word mean? Agrarian? Rural, right? It means farmers. We could call it the world farming crisis, right? So Mike Davis writes, as local safety nets disappeared, right, as the markets became more globalized, as local safety nets disappeared, poor farmers became increasingly vulnerable to any exogenous shock, any shock from the outside, right? Drought, inflation, rising interest rates, or falling commodity prices. All of those things were always around before, right? But they hit farmers more dramatically now than before. In these developing countries, we're also talking about civil war, right? Warlords and chronic civil wars. We're talking about economic dislocations of debt-imposed structural adjustment. We are talking about foreign economic predators, especially in the Congo and Angola. So all of these things together, right, contribute to what we're calling the world agrarian crisis, and people moving from the countryside to the cities at massive rates, right? The result is that rather than the classical stereotype of labor-intensive countryside, right? So the farmers work hard, right? And capital-intensive industrial metropolis. The farmers are poor and they work hard, right? But in the city, they're richer, right? And maybe work a little bit less hard. The third world now contains many examples of capital-intensive countryside and labor-intensive deindustrialized cities, right? So this is his conclusion. Over-urbanization is driven by the reproduction of poverty, not by the supply of jobs. The poorer the world gets, the bigger the cities get. I said I had bad news for you, guys. This is the bad news, right? Okay. And this is the other thing that we have to keep in mind. So the cities are growing, right? He says they have simply harvested this world agrarian crisis, just sort of taken it into themselves. But the cities also have stagnant or negative economic growth. And they don't have the necessary investment in new infrastructure to support all of these people moving there. New infrastructure, educational facilities, or public health systems. So when you put all of these things together, right? When you put all of these things together, what you get is the current situation, which is one of slums. So I'm going to give you guys some numbers about slums, some statistics about slums from this year, 2006, okay? So in 2006, residents of slums make up 6% of the urban population of the developed countries, but 78.2% of the urban population in the least developed countries. The poorer the country, the greater the percentage of urban dwellers living in slum conditions, okay? Here are the countries with the highest percentage of urban residents in slums. Ethiopia, almost 100% of the urban population. Chad, same, 99.4. Afghanistan, almost 100% of the urban population. And Nepal. Now here are the cities with the highest numbers of squatters and tenement dwellers. Do you guys know this word, squatter? What's a squatter? A squatter?
But like illegally, so they just go into the houses and just live there.
They just go into the houses and just live there. Well, someone's house, or maybe a house that's just unoccupied, right? It's illegal occupation of it's illegal occupation of houses, right? So, and we'll see what we mean by that. So, cities with the highest numbers of squatters and tenement dwellers, right? So very low income housing, slum housing. Mumbai is the #1 city. Mexico City and Dhaka. Dhaka is in sorry? Can someone say that louder? In Bangladesh, thank you. Yes, in Bangladesh, that's right. And then, so 9 to 10 million each. And then we've got Lagos, Cairo, Karachi, Kinshasa, which is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. No, Kinshasa. Can you see? How are we doing back there? Do you want me to give you an eye exam? Right, so we've got Lagos, Cairo, Karachi, Kinshasa, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, and Delhi. Okay? I'm giving you these numbers because I think it's interesting to see how they don't exactly line up together. So I brought in some pictures, because I know you love pictures, right? So this is the famous slum in Lagos, in Nigeria. As you see, we are talking about, they call it informal urbanization, over-urbanization, sometimes illegal urbanization. Informal precisely because the city doesn't, this is just sort of happening on its own. The city doesn't have to do anything to accommodate these changes, these people, right? This is another picture of that same slum. This is Mexico City, famously. Here's another picture of Mexico City. Here's a picture of the slums of Mumbai. Here's Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Now there's also this word megaslums, right? Megaslums are when shanty towns and squatter communities merge, right? So they might be set up separately, but what emerges over time are these continuous belts of informal housing and poverty. And they're usually on, and by belt I mean an actual belt, on the periphery, right, of the city. So here is a kind of mega slum, right? This is Sao Paulo. You can see it. It's right on the edge, right, of the luxury condominiums. And here is the same phenomenon in Rio de Janeiro. Here's an interesting picture I found while researching this. This is a slum in Paris that was inhabited mostly by Roma people in Paris. And it's interesting that the internet decided to sort of put them, the internet, as if this is a person, right? Decided to put them side by side to show that, of course, even the wealthiest cities in the world have slums, right? The other thing I found in that book, in that Mike Davis book, is that the country with the fastest growing slums, the highest rate of growth of slums, is Russia. Right? At least this was the case in 2006, right? So especially the ex-socialist company towns dependent on a single now closed industry, right? So obsolete industries, what happens when industries just go kaput, right? And the former Soviet republics. I tried to find out if this was still the case, right? So I Googled this. Is this still the case that Russia is at the top of the list of the countries with the fastest growing slum populations, right? And I couldn't find it. Yes? No, I mean, so there's no one definition of slum, right? So different researching agencies will define it differently in order to get at their numbers, right? It has to do with what they call informal housing. So people creating housing that's outside of the zoning laws, right? Outside of the zoning laws, outside of what the city has provided for. So they're basically not connected to infrastructure. Yes. That's what's meant by slum. Yes.
So I heard that in Russia about 60% of citizens are living in poverty. So
yes, I mean, I read that's what when I was looking this up, what I found was a bunch of websites about the poverty rate, which is a little bit different. Right? So the poverty rate is a different, again, how statisticians figure this out, right? It really, this is why you guys have to take global issues. Guys, SAS students, I think you will be forced to take global issues next year. Yeah, and this is, oh yes, well, next year, I mean after the holidays. In the darkness of winter, right? Global issues are going to happen to you. And this is why it's interesting for you guys to take, because you're actually going to learn about how these numbers are compiled, right? So the thing I can't answer for you is how do they actually get at these claims, right? You're going to learn a little bit about that. Yes?
also, I want to say that I've been traveling through Russia a lot.
Yeah.
And I've seen lots of countrysides that are really dead and people living really like this in the picture. And also I've seen in Novosibirsk, it's actually a big city, but it's also have some sort of slums.
Yeah.
And I've been in this place and it's really creepy.
Creepy? Yeah. I mean, American cities have plenty of slums, by the way. The reason I'm not showing them to you is because we're talking about slums in developing countries, right? But there are certainly plenty of slums. And this phenomenon of people living unconnected to infrastructure, right, is relatively new. I mean, it's something that we haven't seen. Ladies, can I ask you to stop talking, please? You too. Thank you. It's something that we haven't seen really since, like, Charles Dickens's London. Right? Back when you have suddenly this massive industrialization, these people moving into cities in these massive numbers, right? And then you've got the outbreaks of, diseases, right? You've got the outbreaks of the infectious diseases, tuberculosis, cholera, and so on, right? Diseases that, after all of that, right, we thought we had eliminated with modern sanitation. And of course, they are back. Right? And they are back precisely because of these kinds of conditions. Okay? More about disease. I love to talk about disease, so more about disease in a moment. Okay? So don't hold me beholden to any of these numbers because I don't know. I'm just giving you the numbers that I found. When you guys, if you're interested in this phenomenon, it is an absolutely fascinating thing to research. Then you guys have to take global issues, which you have to take anyway. And then you should also seek out David Dussault, who can tell you more about this. And he can tell you about this a little bit more in the Russian context, because that's what he studies. Okay. More pictures. I wanted to show you this because I think it's a pretty unique situation. In Cairo, which has tons of slum housing, there's also something called City of the Dead, which, if you look closely at what this is, these are graves, right? So there's something like over 20,000 people living inside of a cemetery in Cairo. So the place that's called Cairo Necropolis, which is the big Cairo cemetery, right, is actually a slum. People have set up homes. I mean, imagine, over 20,000 people. That's, it's, what do you mean, is it a legal slum? I don't know what you mean.
by that? Do the local authorities allow that to happen?
Well, I mean, they're clearly allowing it to happen to some degree, right? Because there's nowhere else for these people to go. 20,000 people. It's a city. Where are they going to go? Right? So they're allowing it to some degree, but is it legal? No, in the sense that there is no infrastructure there at all. Right? The homes don't have bathrooms, they don't have running water, right? There are no homes there. You can't build a home inside a cemetery. Right? So here's another picture from City of the Dead. There's a ton, because of course photographers have discovered it, so you know what's going to happen now. We're going to have lots of National Geographic moments from City of the Dead. I only give you these two. That's just as a curiosity, okay? Now, so we talked about the countries with the highest rates of urban dwellers living in slums. We talked about the cities with the highest numbers, right, of people living in slums. And then here are the cities with the poorest slums. Okay? Luanda, Maputo, Kinshasa, and Cochabamba in Bolivia, where 2/3 or more of residents earn less than the cost of their minimum required daily nutrition. In Luanda, child mortality is the highest in the world. Okay, and this is a picture that I just happened to find of the Luanda slum. Okay, now why am I talking about all of this? Because I wanted to find a way for us to think about what a natural disaster is. So I want to think about this idea of slum ecology. Right? The reason that slums are so cheap to live in is precisely their proximity to ecological hazards. Right? So they don't just sort of happen to be cheap to live in. Right? They're cheap to live in because they are made, for example, on bad soil, right, that can result in landslides, or that they are in some sort of flooding zone, or in some sort of fire zone, right, precisely because they are in places that are unsafe. Okay? So slums have sort of the perfect ingredients of the coming natural disaster. For that person who said, the question is when? How soon? Sorry, the question is how soon? Right? This is the question for slums, is how soon is the natural disaster? Poverty, excuse me, magnifies geological and climatic hazards. Urban environmental vulnerability is sometimes calculated as the product of hazard. Let me say that again, okay? Urban environmental vulnerability. Here's how we calculate it. Hazard, so the frequency and magnitude of the natural event, times assets, population and shelter exposed, right? Times fragility. And this is really key, fragility. Physical characteristics of the built environment, not the natural environment. Physical characteristics of the built environment, right? So risk, disaster risk, ecological risk, is actually the hazard times the assets times the fragility. What this means right? What this means is that a flood or a landslide or an earthquake can actually be less powerful, right? But do much more damage 20 years later than an earlier one did. Right? If the slums have increased in size, right? So we have examples of this where there are floods, for example, where the water level doesn't rise as high as it did before in some earlier flood, but the damage is much greater. Right? The cost is much greater in terms of life, right? Human life, animal life, in terms of actual sort of economic losses, infrastructure losses. Right? You see what I'm saying? And this is important, I think, because we think of these natural disasters only as if this were the only thing, right? What's the Richter scale magnitude of the earthquake that's coming? How high was the water, right? How bad was the whatever, the mudslide, right? But we don't think about it in terms of this equation, right? That there are all these different factors interacting together. Yes?
Just to clarify, so time fragility is, for example, how stable these constructions are.
Right.
How strongly they will be influenced by the disasters, right?
How
strongly they will be influenced by the disaster. That's what we mean.
I don't understand what you're asking. I'm sorry.
I want to clarify what they mean by times fragility.
Oh, times just means this. Times.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. That's all it means. Times just means this. Yes. Assets? Assets is like the stuff you have. Right? Population, so you count as an asset. Sorry, guys. Right? I do too. Right? Population and shelter. So all the stuff. All the stuff that's going to be costly if we lose it. Right? So it's the event itself, right? The tornado, the whatever, right? Times the assets, which is all the stuff, right? But also times this fragility, which is, I think, a very kind of a more amorphous category, right? The physical characteristics of the built environment. So, for example, Haiti, which I will talk about. Haiti, how do you say in Russian? Ga? You people, this alphabet is. Haiti, as a country, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? The entire nation of Haiti has no zoning laws, has no building codes at all. There are no building codes, right? So you can build a building and there is no code to which to hold it, right? Or against which to measure it. That's a fragile built environment. You understand? Right, so there are no engineer experts who are making sure, whose job it is to make sure that the buildings are up to code. Okay, let me say some things about Haiti. I think it's a very good example. You guys remember the earthquake? 2010? Oh, I forgot. Sorry, this just happened. Yeah, so I got so excited to talk to you, I forgot my big presentation here. Yeah, so if this is true, then we could really say something like there are no natural disasters. Right? The disasters are man-made just as much as they are natural. Right? The disaster factor, right, doesn't just come from nature. Disastrous nature, right? So Haiti is a very good example of this. Here's one of the many pictures you can see of the slums of Port-au-Prince, the capital. This is after the earthquake, right? The earthquake was in 2010, January of 2010. The infrastructure destroyed. Residential and municipal buildings, right inside the capital. All the hospitals destroyed. All air, sea, and land transportation facilities destroyed. All communication systems destroyed. Enormous numbers of exposed corpses, which had to be very quickly disposed of in mass graves, right? From what I could see, there's all this controversy about how many people actually died. The number at which the internet seems to have settled, right, is 160,000 dead. Right, between 1 million and 1.5 million people displaced from their homes. But then you've got this. So this is all stuff that happened, what we can say as a sort of direct, right, direct consequence of the event. But then you've got this, later in that year, right, and then continuing until 2017, you've got what is called the Haitian cholera outbreak, right? The largest modern outbreak of a disease that we thought we had eradicated with the invention of modern sanitation. And from that, you're looking at over 800,000 cholera cases between 2010 and 2017, right? With over 9,000 deaths. Okay, so when we look at something like this, and you bring, saying that the earthquake was a 7 point something on the Richter scale, I don't remember what it was something like that. And then there were like 5 aftershocks, which were at like around 4 or 5 on the scale. So to say it was a huge earthquake, yes, but what makes a huge earthquake? What makes a huge earthquake is all of this loss, right? What makes a huge earthquake is then effects, right? Massive public health crisis going on for a decade, right? As a result of the loss of all that infrastructure. So this is kind of a different way to think about natural disasters. They become not so much an environmental problem, or maybe there are no environmental problems. What am I doing here? What are we doing here in this class, right? Maybe there are no maybe all environmental problems need to be thought about in terms of this kind of complexity.